economic motives precede political ones. We get smuggling way before we get any kind of diplomatic thaw or diplomatic change between the two sides of the strait. We get the trade through Hong Kong or other kind of proxy economic arrangements way before we get the diplomatic structures that support those kinds of trade. And the same for other things. I mean, we heard with mainland wives. Now we're in the middle of a debate about how to treat mainland wives when what's that amazingly high percentage of Taiwanese spouses are mainland wives already. That is, what's driving this isn't people who say, I'm going to go open an office in Shanghai because I believe there's only one China, or because I believe that Taiwan should be independent. They're going to make a living. And yet, as soon as they start doing that, state and state actors, the laws, which are parts of states, of course, the diplomatic relations, all of that become really crucial to them. So there's an important interaction. And I think what I've learned is to think about this in a somewhat different sense. What are the interactions? When does the state loom large as an important actor, and when not? Because often it doesn't. But often we see this mutual pressure where one field is shaping the other field. So the way, in my mind, so I like making little charts the way I guess YU-SHAN also does, but mine started from a completely different place. It was, what's the relationship between the broad kinds of behavior that we've looked at? Economic, movement of bodies, marriages, migrants of one sort or another, religion, flow of information in the media panel. Right? In each of those, how do we relate to the state? And in my columns in the chart in my imagination, I have three broad ways of doing that. Let me call them the black and the white and the gray. The black in the heidao sense of black. The ones that are clearly, that require the state in the sense that, for instance, there would be no smuggling if there were no states, right? If there were no laws, they wouldn't be broken. We would just call this trade. This would just be economics in action, not smuggling. So illegal activities require laws to be there. So in the economic realm, we'd have smuggling, since that came up today, as the black thing. But then it's the gray area that's the huge one. And I don't mean that it's illegal or even extra legal, but I mean it's not really driven by political interests primarily. It's driven by people out to advance their careers, to support their families, to make money. And then we get the nation-state aspect of that. For instance, the regulation of business, the legal mechanisms for dispute settlement that everybody has to have. We can call it two countries, we can call it one country with one system, right? Whatever we call it. In order for people to do business successfully, they need to know that certain kinds of guarantees are in place. I won't go through everything like this, but we could do this with the migration of people from sham wives that came up this morning, or sex workers, through the migrants, both the labor migrants, which we haven't talked about, and the marriage migrants, which we did talk about, and then all of the policy issues that get involved in that. With religion, I don't think there was any discussion of the black bits of religion, but let's just take, for instance, an Yiguandao missionary in mainland China, where Yiguandao is still xiejiao, right? It's quite illegal there. In the gray area would be most of what goes on pilgrimage, right? It's not discouraged by either side of the strait, but it's certainly not what anybody had in mind in their diplomatic negotiations. And then we get the broader policy influences. Again, it was Zhu Yunhan who pointed out that Tzu Chi is now, I think he said, the largest private charitable organization in mainland China. There's a major kind of change. And we get demonstration effects from religion as China is reconsidering its religious policy. Taiwan is one of the examples that they're quite interested in looking at. And then finally, if I can come back to the very beginning, and our two organizers next to me. So we had in Lowell Dittmer's and YU-SHAN's paper, the triangles, right? A very nation-state view of how we should view this, but a global one, right? So talking about global issues, but in terms of nation-states. And clearly, we have to do that to understand what's going on. I don't think there's any doubt about it. But it was framed in that classic political science way that took the nation state as the unit from which we need to begin. And then there was YU-SHAN, one of whose two historiographies that she talked about was the maritime one. The one where the nation state really is almost irrelevant to what's going on. The one that in fact water trade, maritime trade, in all kinds of contexts, is rarely a politically unified thing. If we think of all the major trading routes over water, the Caribbean, the Mediterranean, the South China Sea, they're very rarely unified politically, right? They're always in that in-between, almost always in that in-between kind of space. And yet, if we, where I was yesterday when they were doing those early papers in our session, it's really not the case that we have one thing where nation states don't matter and one thing where only nation states matter. The question is really to bring in when they matter. I mean, it's quite obvious from our last session that nation states do get really deeply involved in the maritime kinds of issues. And at the same time, I think the point many people have tried to make that it's not just triangles of nation states, but it's all of these other kinds of motives are really just as important to what's going on, and we need to understand the balances. And for there, we can go from one end. I think Michael Soni was maybe one extreme, at least for Jinmun, where he argued fairly clearly that you cannot talk about anything without it being phrased in terms of cross-strait relationships, and then a suggestion in his paper that maybe that would increasingly be true in Taiwan as well, to many of the other papers that think you can talk about a lot of things without doing that, but that exactly seems to me the issue that is on the table before us right now. Thanks.
Do we have any comments from the floor? Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Another term that was used a lot, I think, but never was called attention to as much as it might have been, and I think deserves to come back now at this point, is the whole concept of globalization, and that this whole relationship is unfolding in a broader context than merely a bilateral one or a trilateral one, and that you just pointed out that labor was not really addressed in this conference, which I think is a really important missing piece, and would draw that out more clearly. I think it would be well worth keeping that concept front and center in our thinking going forward. And on that same line of thinking, I was just thinking, I've been very struck by the extraordinary English of all of our Chinese participants in this conference, and it makes me realize yet again the very important role of the United States in the educations, the creation of cosmopolitan intellectualism on the part of the Taiwanese intellectuals, and it seems to me that there's more to be done with that. That this isn't. That a lot of the meetings that take place between Chinese mainlanders and Taiwanese are in English, and they're mediated through a kind of an American or an Americanized institutional processes, and that too is worthy of some note, and both literally too, something that I don't think came up in the student discussions, but that. I think Lin Gang seems to know many of his colleagues here from the time, as I understand it, he spent in the United States. And my hunch is that there are many, many people who have forged their relationships actually not either in Taiwan or in the mainland, but primarily in the United States or maybe in Hong Kong. And that too is a component that needs, and there's more merely than person-to-person contact. There's also intellectual contacts that are mediated again through mostly American, but also maybe now and then the Canadian university too. Well, thanks.
Thank you. Other comments, questions? Sarah? Oh.
I just wanted to clarify my earlier comment about state society. When I said rigid, I think what I really meant was that by separating something called state from something called society, we oftentimes lose sight of the way that state effects or the process of generating state power works through a number of different kinds of actors and institutions, some of which might look like states and some of which might not. And in fact, one of the things that I've been struck by in looking at the construction of immigration policy is that it's not simply state actors who are driving this process, but in fact it's a kind of dialogue between a whole range of different groups of people and institutions that sometimes have parallel interests, sometimes have competing interests. And similarly, when we're thinking about cross-strait relations specifically, it's not often the states that are driving the action or that are driving the changes. I think Micah's paper is a really nice example of this, that it's, in fact, this stuff was happening on the ground long before there was any kind of dialogue at an official state level. Similarly, in my case, you see government bureaucrats constantly playing catch-up, basically trying to revise policies to adequately address situations on the ground that are changing much faster than they can deal with it. And so I think that I was simply suggesting that we might lose sight of some of that diversity and nuance if we hold to thinking about state and society as separate and as homogeneous or unified within themselves, and instead thinking more about processes and diverse sets of actors. I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you.
My comment is to a certain extent expired by the chart that was distributed. I was just wondering why current holds such prominence in this chart and why past seems to be underrepresented. And that led me to think, what is the significance of the past in thinking about cross-strait relations? In what ways is the past related to the current? And I think that this, in some ways, feeds into Sarah's comments about process, thinking about people trying to either accumulate knowledge to institutionalize relationships that are happening in real time as things play out on the ground. And also an issue that is a very vexed one in cross-strait relations, past as a way of situating oneself in relation to some kind of identity, and past as a way of thinking about politics, because I was thinking about a recent past. Would we have had this conference in 2005, given the state of Taiwan politics in 2005? To what extent is this a post-2008 intellectual endeavor? Because when I was in Taiwan as a graduate student, a recent PhD, I'm not going to name names, but there was a conference at the Institute of Modern History, and there were two recent PhDs who teach history in Taiwan. One of them does Taiwan history, and one of them does non-Taiwan history. And the one who was doing Taiwan history at that time had a job at a very good university, and the one who was doing mainland history didn't have a good job at a good university. And he said that, well, people aren't doing mainland history now, and they're not interested in Taiwan's relationship with the mainland because given they won't get jobs. And that's all I'll say. He said that's all I'll say about that. And so in some ways, it's worth thinking about the ways in which the political concerns, right, that come out of the very policy-oriented, very high-level, political science problems is in some ways shaping the way in which we're thinking about all of these other issues as well that don't have anything, that ostensibly don't have anything to do with the state per se, right? Or maybe the state influences it and impinges upon it, but we can put it in the realm of society, right? And so it's worth thinking about how we are trying to grapple with these problems in relation to Taiwan's recent political past, right? Are we responding to a period of time in which it was all Taiwan history, it was all Taiwan studies, and Cross-Strait was just something that people didn't really devote themselves to for all kinds of reasons? How do we situate what we're doing in relation to the politics of the present in Taiwan and the politics of the recent past?
Sure.
I mean, I hate to, keep Ilau Mailao, and it's terrifying the fact that chronologically, I think I'm probably the second oldest person in the room now. At Berkeley, we had a conference. It was either 1986 or 1987 with the Shanghai Shelby Kashuyan. And Zhang Zhongli was the Yuanzhang, and he came, and we had some scholars from Taiwan too. And this was just an enormous deal. And it's interesting to see who was important on Taiwan at that time to represent a sort of Taiwan point of view, and then ask, where are they now? And because I hadn't thought of this in a while, but it would be a really interesting project for a grad student or so, or anybody, to go and look at the transcript of that conference or other conferences that were held in the 80s, when cross-strait relations just really began to become regular, as opposed to just sort of toe-to-toe, but they became more regularized. And it was a lot of it when you mentioned about a meeting abroad. It was people who Berkeley would be the sort of venue, and it was question is, can somebody from Taiwan and China meet at the same conference? In 1992, there was a conference at Xiamen University that was funded by someone from Taiwan, and it was initially called a Guoji Huiyi, and then they had to downgrade it to, could not be called a Guoji Huiyi because you had people from Taiwan and the United States could not participate in a Guoji Huiyi. I mean, the whole sensitivity to these kinds of things. There was one other. Anyway, it just seems to me that it would be a really good exercise to go back and look at the types of issues that were fresh and controversial and new. And now it's stuff that it's just, it's no big deal. Everybody just takes things. That's part of what institutionalization means. It's the things you take for granted, and then you move on to the next crisis. One of the far and away least cited papers that I ever published was at the conference that Bob Scalapino organized between Berkeley and the Shanghai Institute of International Studies in 1985, called "The Status Quo is Not Static." I like the title. I didn't think it was that bad, but nobody's ever paid the least bit of attention to it. But I think that was to try to get this idea that even though many people say, oh, there hasn't been any change, just a phenomenal amount of change. The things I mentioned this, I think, 2 years ago, is that this mobile horizon idea, that the line of what you can take for granted just keeps moving so dramatically. And one thing, Tim, that I thought you were going to say on the language thing is that, also I would, just blown away by the level of English and the fact that English is the official language of the conference. 所以我建议我们下一次开会，我们以中文作为那个会议的正式语言。不好意思 ，really, huh? Not Taiwanese. Why?
Two comments. Like Rob, I'm afraid I divide
the political scientists and the rest. And I don't read a whole lot in cross-strait relations, but it occurs to me that what really strikes me as new that I learned from the last 2 days is the various ways in which the people from the various disciplines are thinking about cross-strait relations as something that is experienced, as something that people inhabit. So I was phrasing this as the politics of everyday life, but I think that what really strikes me is there are all these different ways in which cross-strait relations has become part of human experience. And that just strikes me, I mean, what Taiwan should do in the face of China's growing power, that is intellectually the status quo, right? Because people have been talking about that for decades now. What strikes me as fresh here is the way in which, as I said, this is something that is inhabited, which raises some questions for me to YU-SHAN's framing, and actually this is actually why I wanted to pursue the state-society question with you further, because, and actually it also relates to something you just said. We all have these moments, I think, so I'm not going to tell my story, but we all have these moments where you just say, this is just bukasli. Right? I'm doing something here that, so my example was when I borrowed my mainland friend's car in Tainan to go to YU-SHAN or whatever. I mean, it just boggles my mind that my mainland buddy lives in Tainan and has a car, and I can borrow it. I don't think it's right to think about that. So that one of the ways that people have been talking about over the last few days is in terms of negotiations, and I don't think that's the right way of thinking about it. And I think there's a problem there with I mean, it's a familiar dichotomy, agency versus structure. What's the structure? Right? The horizons are moving so rapidly. I mean, it seems like agency, it seems like we're dealing on both your dichotomies, state and society, or agency versus structure. In both sets, we've got two dependent variables. And that just strikes me as and this is actually why I want to talk to you about it, because I was trying to write about that in my paper, but it's actually really hard, because you can't grasp anything. Because every time you try to present the experience as responding to either state changing or society changing, you have to abandon the mobility. Do you see what I mean? It's just, I'm talking about just purely as an exercise in writing. Right? It's very hard to write about everything changing all at once, and that strikes me as if there was going to be a sort of theoretical innovation that came out of this, I think that would be where to start.
Could I respond to that very quickly? Well, when I introduced those dichotomies, I meant them as heuristic devices. In other words, these are heuristic devices, conceptual tools helping us to do the thinking, but they are not structures or concepts out there governing the way that we do our reasoning, description, or analysis. And I also, I wanted to make sure that I do not leave our colleagues in political science with the impression that we do not value their input. For what they do is extremely valuable, especially as their style of work is set alongside the style of work of the rest of us. In other words, these are temperamental, stylistic, discursive differences among ourselves as we try to think our way through some of these very difficult problems. some of us have a higher degree of tolerance or preference for things which are open-ended, ambiguous, ill-defined, and work in progress. Others would prefer, simply as a matter of intellectual style, to come to grip with things in a certain way. So these are stylistic differences. Of course, it falls upon the author or whoever who does the work to make decisions about which style, in one's own judgment, might best suit the set of phenomenon that you are looking at. But in itself, it should never be either prescriptive or exclusive.
Can I respond just quickly?
Can we move that to the dinner side in the
Let him
interest?
say one word. Let him say one word.
Okay.
No, come on, YU-SHAN, let him say just.
Well, first of all, I'd say two words. I would also, I certainly didn't want to come off as dismissing the contribution of political science. But on your point, on your point about agency structure, state society as heuristic devices, another way of saying what I was trying to say was that it strikes me that when heuristic devices seem to become unhelpful for heuristic purposes, that's an interesting moment. No, not necessarily a straitjacket. They just, when they're not explaining the things that we think they can help us explain, that's worthy of recognition and response.
As a conclusion and as a response from the political science, political scientists, this one sitting on the panel, has already been persuaded as to the shortcomings of political science. That's the very reason for this conference to be held. And so I've been, listening and learning, like, sucking the knowledge from all of you with great delight. And so I don't really see any contradiction between different disciplines. I only see mutual enrichment. And this is already 6:35 in the evening, and I bet we have more political scientists in this room than any other disciplines. So we are not, we are among you. We are with you, and let's go for dinner. Okay, thank you.